Hello, everyone. My name is Rachel Jean-Baptiste, and I'm the Michelle Mercer and Bruce Golden Family Professor in Feminists and Gender Studies here at Stanford, member of the Department of African and African American Studies. And on behalf of Grant Parker, who is the interim director of the Center for African Studies, welcome to this 2024 Centering Africa talk. And I should tell you what this talk aims to do. So this lecture aims to showcase the work and contributions of leading figures of intellectual thought across the continent. And in centering the particular stories of Africa is also to think about how centering human issues on the continent actually brings about universal values. So this is a really important thing because I know there's so many demands on your time. So before I start, let me just shine a spotlight, if you will, on the numbers of people the resources that it took to put this event together. And it was truly a village. And so those include the Center for African Studies, the Clayman Institute for Gender Research, the Creative Writing Program, the Department of English, as well as the Department of African and African American Studies, the Office of the Dean of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences, and the Stanford Humanities Center. So thank you. And there's also a lot of individuals who contributed often invisible labor to do this. And I'll let Tsitsi speak their names so that it's very honorific. So today we're going to focus on the process of storytelling. And we have a muse in Tsitsi Dangarembga being the person to channel this for us. And when I say muse, I mean the dictionary definitions in terms of any of the 9 sister goddesses in Greek mythology who presided over song, poetry, and the arts, and also the literal definition of a source of inspiration. So today we have Tsitsi Dangarembga, one of the most impactful, insightful, and multifaceted multimedia creative practitioners of our time. So she's a writer of fiction, a poet, a filmmaker, a playwright and director of plays, an activist for free speech, and also an advocate for African women, also telling their own stories and harnessing the tools of storytelling. So born in Zimbabwe, but also raised in England in a moment of late 20th century decolonization and what was Rhodesia, first Southern Rhodesia, and then Rhodesia at the time, in a moment of racial apartheid. So out of this extremely traumatic moment, if you will, came extraordinary processes of storytelling. So she's the author of 3 works of fiction, often referred to as the Tambudzai Trilogy. Nervous Conditions, published in 1988, The Book of Naught in 2006, and This Mournable Body in 2018. And it's really notable to note that you were 28 years old when you wrote Nervous Conditions. And as someone in this audience already said, you told my story. And I felt that way when I was a graduate student on this campus decades ago and read Nervous Conditions. I literally felt like my story was being told. And so Nervous Conditions borrows its title from Jean-Paul Sartre's introduction to Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth that talks about, quote, a disassociated self that was created during colonialism, and that the state of native, quotes, Sartre said, was a nervous condition, introduced and maintained by the settler among colonized people with their consent. But in writing the stories of colonized peoples, if you will, and all the agency and how they're telling themselves, it's to take away this idea of a disassociated self, and indeed people making themselves through telling their stories. So not only was she a writer of fiction, but she also went to Germany to study film and has a filmography that includes over 2,000 films, one of which is the highest grossing film in Zimbabwe history. So I say this to say that Tsitsi Dangarembga is a person who has done many firsts. Those firsts include the first Black woman to publish a book in English in Zimbabwe, the first Black woman to produce a feature film in Zimbabwe. But as I said this afternoon at the workshop, she is the first, but she has made sure that she is not the last. So in fact, her other work has been not a gatekeeper, but a key holder in founding institutions and forums for other African peoples to tell their stories, particularly women. So this includes founding the Institute for Creative Arts for Progress in Creative Arts in Africa, which facilitates, produces, and trains in the production of uplifting, innovative projects in all artistic genres. She's also the founder of a festival called the International Images Film Festival for Women, in which women are the creative producers of stories, of their own stories. And it's the only film festival for women across the entire continent. So not only has she does this work for others, but there are also a notable list of accolades, and I could go on and on about them, but I'll give you just a few. So one of her books was shortlisted for the Booker Prize in 2021. She also won the 2021 PEN International Award for Freedom of Expression, residency at the Bellagio Center. And in 2006, the British magazine The Independent called her, quote, one of the 50 greatest artists shaping the African continent. And within the past 2 years, her own history of activism also translated into a very traumatic episode of being arrested for protesting and advocating for the freedom of speech of journalists in Zimbabwe. So it is such a terrific honor to have you here. We are so honored. And without further ado, Tsitsi Dangarembga.
So I was just thanking you for your wonderful introduction, Professor Jean-Baptiste. I would like to acknowledge you and your team and all the energy, time, and effort that was expended to bring me here. So I am also thankful to Harmony Sharafeldin. Thank you. Oh yeah, now you can hear me better. Excellent. So I'm hoping that I get the pronunciations correctly. I was going to practice them, but I fell asleep because I'm still a bit jet lagged. So thank you, Harmony. Also, Robin Chapdelaine of the Center for African Studies and Leah Chase of the Feminist Gender and Sexualities Studies program for all that great work in making this evening possible. In addition, I'm told that Professor Joelle Cabrita is not here this evening, but she was actually the person who reached out to me via email. And I was so very excited to see an invitation from someone in Stanford who hails from my part of the world, Southern Africa. And I'm very grateful that she did write that email. And finally, I am grateful as always to my husband, Olav Koshka, who keeps me focused on the task at hand by attending to all the technical requirements surrounding my work. I'm not sure whether I should actually have said that this close to Silicon Valley, but it is what it is. I'm also greatly honored that everyone in the room today decided to share the next hour or so with me. I appreciate your time. Thank you and good evening. Today, I will describe some of the work I have done in producing narrative over the last 4.5 decades. Narrative production whose aim is to increase the agency of women in Zimbabwe in particular and in Africa in general. I will begin with an overview of my film work. I will go on to talk about my literary production. I will conclude with short comments which situate my work in African feminist practice. When I speak about narrative production, I refer to my film work and my literary work. I have conducted my film work through 3 organizations. The first was my very own private production house, Nyerai Films PLC, which I founded in 1992 in Harare. The second was Women Filmmakers of Zimbabwe, acronym WFOZ. It's pronounced a bit differently. It's pronounced in the Zimbabwean way, which is WUFOS. So the second of the organizations was WUFOS. WUFOS was founded in 1996 by women professionally active in the film industry in Zimbabwe. The founder was the late Petronilla Munongoro, who asked me to join the organization in 1998. Yes, it's a while. I became the chairperson 2 years later. WUFOS's purpose was to address the representation and misrepresentation of women in front of and behind the camera in Zimbabwe. The organization was dissolved in 2020 due to a number of challenges, which in my thinking arose from hegemonic narratives, both national and international. I will speak more about these later. At this point, suffice to say that these hegemonic narratives give rise to systems of discrimination and exclusion. Due to the pressures that impacted negatively on woofers, I had founded in 2009 the Institute of Creative Arts for Progress in Africa, ICAPA Trust, whose logo is shown on the slide. The ICAPA logo depicts a woman carrying a film reel on her head. She is rising out of a staff, the staff being a symbol of power in many African countries, including my own. ICAPA Trust incorporated both women filmmakers of Zimbabwe and Nyerai Films under one umbrella. In this way, I could fundraise for both entities. It also allowed me to have a not-for-profit arm of Nyerai Films, in addition to the private company, to facilitate fundraising for production activities. I'll break the film activities I have engaged in down into firstly, film exhibition activities, and secondly, training and production. I'm going to play a short video clip to begin the exhibition section. Following filmmaker practice, I'll start it without an introduction beyond the information in the slide that this is an ICAPA Trust event. So please be patient and garner whatever you can from it. Most of all, I'd like you to be open to the feeling which the clip evokes.
In the silence of the morning, the sun awakens and opens the world in colors. Each ray is a hug, a promise, and life dances to the sound of the winds. Beautiful life, how beautiful you are. Woven into threads of hope and stars. Every day is a gift, every day is a gift. To paint with love and laughter. Steps that intersect, dreams that intertwine. And in the gaze of a stranger, we find pieces of ourselves. Beautiful life, how beautiful you are. Woven into threads of hope and stars. Every day is a gift, every day is a gift. To paint with love and laughter.
Yes, the video was about the opening of the International Images Film Festival for Women, IIFF or IF, which took place in Harare earlier this year. The green and black logo, which was on the title page, is the IF logo. We have two logos because government policy at the time IF was founded directed that we create separate registration for the festival and not use the parent body logo. I suspect it was a fundraising strategy. This requirement was rescinded recently when registration fees were increased by around 1,500%. But the branding effects remain, at least for the foreseeable future. The video itself was made by a young woman temporarily employed as the festival hospitality manager this year. For me, the interesting thing that prompted my sharing the video is that the young woman did not need to make the clip at all. Her job description was to see to the needs of the festival's guests. This she did admirably, but she also found time to produce a video clip without being required to do so. I read this act of video making as an act of confidence in IF, coming from a member of the population which the festival was created to serve. This video tells me the festival is very important to this young woman and extrapolating, hopefully, also to other young women like her. IF was founded with the objectives that you can see in the slide. These objectives relate to setting an international standard in filmmaking in Zimbabwe through the films exhibited. Our vision was and continues to be that the films exhibited will impact the filmmaking in Zimbabwe in general and amongst Zimbabwean women in particular, because IF screens films that portray a woman in a lead role. I am very concerned about scenarios in which a lower standard is set for marginalized individuals because these lower standards perpetuate marginalization as the products resulting from these lower standards are not competitive. Other equally important IF objectives are those around increasing public engagement with women's issues and around providing for income and career generating pathways for women in film and creative industries. Of course, income generation and career generation are two different things. IF exhibits films from around the globe. The main festival, which takes place in Harare, screens 60 films in 5 venues in the city's central business district and in the city's high-density areas. Those are the former townships. Several masterclasses take place during the main festival. Following the main event, we conduct national outreaches to other urban areas, such as Bulawayo and Mutare, Zimbabwe's second and fourth largest cities, respectively. And the outreach also conducts programs in rural communities as far afield as the Zambezi Valley and the Northern Escarpment. I will show you a map and you can see where the northern border is. That's the Zambezi Valley. So you have an idea of the distance, with Harare being somewhat central. IF has a program of workshops associated with the festival. This year, we held a 3-week story and script development for the screen workshop and a 1-week pre-production workshop. Finally, over the last 2 years, the festival was the site of networking by African women filmmakers. This networking led to a Kappa Trust signing in May this year a memorandum of understanding with Sisters Working in Film and Television, SWIFT, in South Africa, and the Pan-African Observatory for Cinema and Audiovisual, OPAC, based in Djibouti. The 3 organizations have come together for the purpose of promoting African women's presence in the continental and global film industries under the name AWOFA, which stands for African Women Filmmakers Alliance. Moving on, I have grouped training and film production together because film production is extremely capital intensive, so that it is easier to raise money for training activities than it is to raise resources for production. To maximize on both training and production, I use a training with production model in my training activities. And I also conduct extensive on-the-job training during shoots. This evening, I will talk about my fiction film production, as there is not time to include my documentary work as well. On the slide is a selection of 6 short fiction films I have made over the years. The first column gives the title of the film and the production year. Most of the films have a running time of about half an hour. There are a couple of exceptions to this. Pamvura is about 15 minutes long, while Nyami Nyami and the Evil Eggs runs for about 3/4 of an hour. I produce my films in languages of the Bantu language group, which are Zimbabwean languages of indigenous African origin. All but one of the titles you see are in Shishona or Tonga, depending on the language spoken in the film world. I supply English language titles for these. There is a trend in Zimbabwe today to make films in English. I do not understand this trend, and I do think it accounts for the lack of success of many of our films. We can talk about that later, Zimbabweans in the room. The second column is my role in the productions. Most of that is self-evident, except perhaps where creative producer is mentioned. That catch-all phrase really means jack of all trades. When I take work as a creative producer, I end up doing a little bit of everything. This was the case with the 3 training projects listed. Those training projects were initiated in 2003 when WUFOS launched a program called the Women's Narrative Workshops. The objective was to make comprehensive training in film skills from development to delivery available to Zimbabwean women creatives. These workshops were to create a safe space for creative women in Zimbabwe, where the women could allow themselves to feel vulnerable without either fearing or experiencing negative consequences. WUFOS published a call in local newspapers which asked, "Sisters, what is your story?" and which requested women interested in narrative making to respond. 4 stories from more than 4 dozen entries that women sent in were selected to serve as material for adaptation into 4 short films, respectively. A second call invited women who specifically wanted to be trained in screenwriting to apply. Understanding that women filmmakers will work with men throughout their careers, WUFOS instituted a policy to include up to 33% of men in its programs. This policy is still in place today at Ikapa Trust. At the time the policy was initiated in 2003, WUFOS ended up with 3 women trainee script writers and 1 man. The 4 stories were adapted into short film scripts. The following year, a small grant from a European donor institution allowed for production of 2 of the 4 scripts. No woman came forward to direct, and so both of the films were directed by men. WUFOS succeeded in raising funds for a further short film in 2016. By this time, gender dynamics in the local industry had started to shift. In Her Father's Village, the 3rd film in the training project, was co-directed by the woman who wrote the story and a male director. Returning to the slide, the 3rd column shows the production house that produced the film. The 2 training films released in 2005 were produced by WUFOS. We had called WUFOS's production wing Mama Media. I still like the name. The 2016 production is listed under the African Women Filmmakers Hub. By 2016, I had realized that a national approach to women's filmmaking in Africa was not going to work for a number of reasons I do not have time to go into here. The African Women Filmmakers Hub was a first attempt to extend WFOS's activities to the rest of the continent. There would be others in the course of time. The training programs have been very successful. Inspired by the #MeToo movement in 2020, Ikapa Trust began to produce a series of video clips on sexual violence against women. The series, called Picture My Life, is ongoing. Its scope has expanded to include other aspects of Zimbabwe's female community's experience, such as violence against women in general and participation in matters of public importance, such as voting. The Trust training programs have been so successful that the crews on the Picture My Life shoots are all women formally trained by WFOS and Ikapa Trust. The festival regularly uses the Picture My Life videos as prompts to discussion in its outreach. To date, we have produced 13 Picture My Life videos. You can see the women who crewed some of the shoots in the slide. Hope this is going to work. Yes, it did. One of the short films, The Sharing Day, was produced as a commission from Media for Development International, MFDI, an American not-for-profit organization. MFDI operated out of Tanzania at the time The Sharing Day was produced. These production circumstances account for the film's English language title, although the film itself is in Shishona with English subtitles. The other two short films in the list, Kare Kare Jako and Nyami Nyami Amaji Aburosi, that's Nyami Nyami and the Evil Eggs, that title being in Tonga, were produced by my own production house, Nyerai Films. All the films produced by my initiatives, whether in a training context or other contexts, have been screened on at least 2 continents. Of the 5, Peretera Maneta and Kare Kare Jako were the most successful. People who were at the workshop saw the final scene of Peretera Maneta, where a teacher says goodbye to a school pupil. Peretera Maneta tells the story of a child living with albinism called Maneta. Maneta's headmaster at school abuses her sexually until a teacher exposes him. Peretera Maneta won top prizes at festivals in Tanzania and Senegal, and is also very useful in Ikapa Trust outreach programs. Kare Kare Jako, that's the story that was also screened this afternoon at the workshop. I think we had 3 excerpts from that. Kare Kare Jako was even more successful than Peretera Maneta, I think because of the novelty. The story is loosely adapted from an old Zimbabwean folktale about a man who kills his wife in a time of drought in order to eat her, not knowing that his wife can magically take revenge. Out of interest, Zimbabwean people in the room, did anyone know this story before? Oh, no hands. Do we? I usually get a show of hands. It's quite well known, and it's actually a very well-loved story amongst children in Zimbabwe. My grandmother told it to me. And it obviously had a lot of impact because I remembered it over the decades and also decided to make a film about it. The prompt to my making Kare Kare was the feminist message in the film's ending, as well as the fact that, as a folktale, the film offered me scope to experiment with ways of producing the kind of spectacle that is required to make a film visually interesting to viewers, in at least an apparently culturally authentic manner. Kare Kare was awarded prizes on and off the continent and was longlisted at Sundance back in its day. Listed in this next slide are the 3 feature films, long feature films, fiction, where I was employed formally. My employment was variously as story writer, script consultant, and director. Both the production house that produced these 3 films, Media for Development Trust and Zim Media, were registered in Zimbabwe at the time of production. All 3 films were screened in Zimbabwean cinemas back in the 1990s, with Neria becoming Zimbabwe's highest grossing film at the box office when it was released. The organizations have since left Zimbabwe. The American not-for-profit MFD relocated Tanzania and rebranded to Media for Development International before it ceased production activities. Zim Media now operates out of England and South Africa. The negative consequence to the Zimbabwean film sector is that there is no longer any local production house that can raise any kind of reasonable production budget. Some of these long fiction films were actually shot on celluloid. So that's 90 minutes of celluloid. So you can imagine the kind of budget that these production houses were able to raise. I now move on to talk about my literary output. I began to be conscious of a serious urge to write when I was in my early 20s. At that point in my life, the identity I gave myself was informed by 2 categories, gender and melanation, the latter commonly called race. Within these categories, the first identity I became conscious of as an internalized identity that I accepted was the identity of girl. In fact, when I say girl, I put a positive spin on the situation. Today, I describe the identity I invested in as a young person who lived with family in colonial Rhodesia as not boy, rather than as girl. Experience of this negation set in motion my lifelong preoccupation with the experience of being embodied as a woman in the world as it, the world, currently presents itself to me. My experience of woman embodiment activated my engagement with women's agency and empowerment and how to foster these. Today, I realize I may have experienced the category of melanation before I experienced the category of gender, but was unable to process the experience and therefore was unable to put it into words. The category of melanation sorts people according to concentrations of pigment in their skin, with the world attributing value in inverse proportion to the amount of pigment observed. In my case, this second identification developed in the opposite way from the first, not by a process of exclusion, but a process of inclusion. I became a member of the category Black and realized that my worth was devalued accordingly. I internalized this construction of who I was during my teenage years when I was a pupil at a multiracial school in Rhodesia. This is a map of Rhodesia, and I was very proud to find one that actually says Rhodesia. And the other colonial name, can anyone spot the other colonial name on this map? Any offers? Yes, the Salisbury, yes, and Southwest Africa, which is now Namibia. And this is from that site, www Rhodesia, which is misspelled, apologies, .me.uk. Gosh, I thought I'd actually copy and pasted it, never mind. Yes, so that is a map of Rhodesia, which is also a map of Zimbabwe. So you can see up towards Zambia there. That is the Zambezi Valley, and Salisbury is what is Harare now. So we go quite a long way in our outreaches. So yes, Rhodesia, located in the central part of Southern Africa. At the time, which was the 1970s, the Rhodesian government specified quotas concerning how many highly melanated young people were permitted to attend schools designated multiracial, where the student body consisted predominantly of lowly melanated youth. And those who have read the Book of Not might remember a scene where Tambudzai and her friends go to the headmistress, and they are told that because the percentage of highly melanated people calculated it into a portion of a person, they should not be concerned about anybody being chopped in half. And the headmistress thought this was a joke. Although I understood that I was not boy and that I was Black by the time I reached my 20s, I was not conscious of the interaction of these two categories at that time. It was the 1980s. Kimberly Crenshaw had begun her work on intersectionality on the western shore of the Atlantic. Note, it's the western shore of the Atlantic, not the eastern coastline of America. So she had begun her work on intersectionality on the western shore of the Atlantic. However, as ensconced in Harare, the capital city of a small country whose collective mind was obsessing about its colonial past, I did not hear about Crenshaw's seminal work until decades later. Imagine that. The ZANU-PF government in Zimbabwe passed the Legal Age of Majority Act in 1982, the year I went up to the University of Zimbabwe in Harare. This act provided that all Zimbabweans attained full adult status at the age of 18, in contrast to the colonial dispensation in which most Black women had been considered legal minors who were permanently subject to the guardianship of a male family member. The act led to a flurry of women's organizing in the country back in the 1980s. This organizing took place at the University of Zimbabwe also. This is how I discovered feminism. When I was in my third decade, feminist discourse grabbed hold of my imagination and never let go. Because of feminism, I was able to reverse my negating self-identification as not boy and claim a positive identity for myself as woman. The identity woman enabled me to question why I had not achieved a more positive identification before. Feminist doctrine posited that socialization in the home contributed significantly to girl children failing to achieve a positive identification with womanhood. I began to scrutinize socialization processes within the family, and also to examine other symbolic systems by which identity is transmitted in society. Both my studies in the Department of Social Sciences and my own informal research confirmed that systems of storytelling are powerful transmitters of identity. I noted for the first time that the narratives I had been exposed to as I grew up were ones in which female humans were barely present, so that the world seemed to consist in number and agency only of men. I accepted I could not influence my society's socialization processes because these occurred in people's homes. However, it was clear to me that I could impact narrative making by creating a woman-centered narrative myself. So I set to work on new projects and returned to old ones with renewed energy. Community is always important to me as a writer. I view community as my potential readers, and I endeavor to be faithful to this community. I joined the University of Zimbabwe Drama Club. My new feminism proved me against my disappointment at the scarcity at the time of plays that told stories of female antagonists. I sat down to write them. My first play, a one-act play called The Loss of the Soil, which I wrote and produced in 1982, featured male and female leads. The man was highly melanated, while the woman was lowly melanated. A year later, my melanated feminist identity had grown more robust. I wrote, produced, and directed my second play, She No Longer Weeps. She No Longer Weeps is a one-act tragedy in which two young Zimbabweans, Martha and Freddie, fall in love. When Martha falls pregnant, the two are unable to sustain their relationship due to societal attitudes concerning young women's out-of-wedlock pregnancies, which attitudes Freddie, strangely enough, also harbors. Martha, who is studying for a law degree, interrupts her studies to have her baby. She has the tenacity to return to complete her course after the baby's birth. By this time, however, Freddie has abandoned her for another woman. Martha never forgives Freddie for the abandonment. When she becomes a successful lawyer, she plots and carries out violent revenge. Of course, the scenario of young women becoming pregnant while pursuing their education is not peculiar to Zimbabwe. However, Zimbabwe does have very strict abortion legislation, which curtails the choices available to young women around whether or not to carry a pregnancy to term. It is very early writing, but I was glad to give expression to the rage I felt about these women's situations. In the slide, you can read a quote of Martha's from early in the play when she is trying to win Freddie over. There have been several school performances of the play since it was published. It has also been listed as a set book by the Zimbabwe Schools Examination Council. It's inexplicable, but it happened. This is not the time to go into the vagaries of the publishing industry in Zimbabwe, so I won't be distracted by that, other than to say my relations with the publisher, the College Press, who published the play in 1987, began well. This slide shows the covers of the 3 novels which followed She No Longer Weeps. All of the books have been published by multiple publishing houses, so I won't bore you or myself with the publication history. The covers shown in the slide are from the current Faber and Faber edition. I'm happy finally to have found a home for my writing, and I look forward to continuing with Faber and Faber. In the United States, my books are published by Grey Wolf. It's exciting to have an American publisher too. The 3 volumes constitute what I call the Tambudzai Trilogy. The series opens with Nervous Conditions, continues with the Book of Not, and concludes with This Mournable Body. I started writing Nervous Conditions a couple of years before I went up to the University of Zimbabwe. At that time, the story was simply meant to be the story of a young girl taking advantage of the promises of independence. It seemed to me that girls in my culture internalized prohibitions that did not permit them to act in ways which might be beneficial to them as individuals. Independence promised to make opportunities available to all, and so I wanted to empower Zimbabwean girls to give themselves permission to take full advantage of the new independent Zimbabwe. I finished writing Nervous Conditions in 1983 or 4 thereabouts. The novel was not what the editors in Zimbabwe, who were mainly young men returned from self-exile during the years of conflict, were looking for. I was unable to publish in Zimbabwe. My first novel was eventually published in England in 1988 by the Women's Press, at a time when South African expat, the late Ros de Lannerol, was commissioning editor. I believe that the fact that Ros was South African and against apartheid enabled her to relate to the story I had written. By the time Nervous Conditions was published, I had given up on a career in writing and was soon to travel to Berlin to study filmmaking. Studying filmmaking delayed and complicated my prose writing. I returned to writing with the Book of Not in 2006, followed by This Mournable Body 2018, and finally Black and Female in 2020. The Book of Not continues Tambudzai Trilogy, the protagonist's story, from where it left off in Nervous Conditions on the eve of Zimbabwe's liberation war against British settler rule, a war that began in the mid-1960s and intensified in the mid-1970s until a cessation of conflict was negotiated in 1979 in an agreement which led to my country's first elections under universal franchise in 1980. The event of independence takes place in the middle of the Book of Not, allowing the second half of the text to narrate the protagonist's fortunes in a newly independent Zimbabwe. This mournable body evaluates Zimbabwe's post-independent society further through the lens of gender. This final novel in the trilogy also reflects on the aftermath of the liberation struggle in a way that I hope gives some insight into current Zimbabwean society. Recently, after many years of effort, I have managed to have Nervous Conditions and the Book of Not translated into Chishona by Harare Publishing House, House of Books. Thank you. Black and Female is a collection of 3 personal essays about my path to becoming a writer and the perspectives this path has given me on the world I am required to negotiate. I have put the quote about the geography of my asylum from the introduction to the book up on the slide because that sentence summarizes the book's project very well. The slide shows the cover of the Grey Wolf edition. While my prose production has generally been a solitary pursuit, outbreaks of violence around the 2008 elections in Zimbabwe prompted me to create for Ikapa Trust a project called Winning the Peace, a project for people power in Zimbabwe. Winning the Peace was a multidisciplinary nationwide Zimbabwean arts project designed to encourage pro-peace mindsets and behaviors in the Zimbabwean public. The objective was to create narrative in literature, drama, and film, which would serve as prompts to community discussions. I made little progress with this social enterprise until I changed the Winning the Peace part of the title to Breaking the Silence. After the name change, a funding body made a small grant available. Working with a men's group called Padare to extend our reach, Ikapa Trust once again put a call out for real life stories concerned with any kind of violence perpetrated on anyone in the country. The reason for requesting real life stories was so as to validate our work and avoid being accused of spreading false information about the country. We received over 100 stories written in one of Zimbabwe's 3 main languages, Shishona, Ndebele, and English. The grant was insufficient to accommodate film, but using the material received, my organization workshopped 2 plays that toured to 4 venues. Ikapa also conducted a prose writing workshop concerned with writing the trauma of the stories people had sent in to us. 5 of the 7 participants were women, with 2 being men. 80% of the women completed their stories, that was 4 out of the 5, while neither of the men was able to. The workshop was facilitated by Canadian writer Madeleine Tien with Ignatius Mabasa and myself from Zimbabwe. Mabasa also contributed 2 short stories, while I contributed 1. Participant and facilitator combined efforts resulted in an anthology of 7 short stories called A Family Portrait. The book is currently in print in Zimbabwe in English, also from House of Books, and in a German language edition in Germany. I'm currently continuing my individual writing with what is meant to be another trilogy, but please don't hold your breath. I am not. I would now like to talk a little bit about my process. This will lead me into wrapping up with some words on agency and hegemonic discourses. My process is fundamentally self-referential in the sense described by Alice Walker, who has written about the necessity and paucity of models for melanated women's narrative production and the intense demands of being both the sculptor and the model. In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, Miss Walker writes about these issues and how they affect the creative process. Walker describes how the work of Zora Neale Hurston validated her early writing interests and provided her with research material for her writing at the beginning of her career. What Walker does not explain, perhaps because it is inexplicable, is what prompted her to understand the vital importance of melanated women's narrative production in our human project. However, Walker does indicate how melanated women's narrative production enriches the human project when she writes about the larger perspective, connections made. Thus, I think this quote deserves a moment of silence, so please reflect on what she says in silence for a minute. I call this larger perspective, connections made, the human project. That my process is self-referential, even if of necessity, is the reason why I was extremely surprised to find myself asked to share the work I have done with women in Zimbabwe with you this evening. Self-reference is not ordinarily an accepted form of knowledge production in our current epistemological dispensation. Nevertheless, my attempts to explain myself to myself are the foundation of all the narrative making I have done and will do, whether individually or in community with others. Self-reference as a means of knowledge production has several characteristics that make it a difficult method of coming to knowledge. Firstly, self-reference can be exhausting because it involves being near and distant to oneself at the same time, or rather near to and distant from oneself at the same time. Secondly, it unfolds in isolation without the relief of collegiality. Thirdly, it may seem as though not much is happening to people who are beyond the boundaries of the self in question. It seems to me, therefore, reasonable to observe that as distance from a given self decreases engagement with the processes of said self, and these processes are worked out in narrative, then distance from self is positively correlated to distance from narrative produced by said self. This in turn means we have a problem on our hands in terms of the human project of the larger perspective, connections made or at least attempted where none existed before, as proposed by Alice Walker. How can we interest people to read about people they do not know in the interests of the human project? My literary work falls within a tradition of establishing connections. It is self-referential because one of the connections I aim to establish, or rather re-establish, is the connection between the colonized subject's subjectivity and the colonized subject's self. Another connection I strive to make in my writing is between the selves of the many individual people who were subjected to colonial enterprise. It is important to me to provide a prompt and a space to assist colonized subjects to remember who they really are, in spite of a presenting dismemberment occasioned by the requirements of surviving colonization. My engagement with the film industry showed it to be another site of trauma for a person embodied as I am. It was largely my engagement with the film industry that brought me to realize how Blackness itself is a category composed of sets of people whose relative set value is determined by their distance from the African continent, or more accurately, their proximity to the global north. The categories Black and African were used for the most part interchangeably in Rhodesia, where I grew up, and this continues in Zimbabwe today. So that up until I began to engage with theories of narrative as a film student, my experience of Blackness was one of belonging to a group rather than of being excluded from group membership. During my film studies, I realized there existed categories of Blackness that excluded me, and that only a subset of Black, that is, African, was available to me for membership. This was made very clear by film literature, where Black generally referred to members of the African diaspora and most frequently to highly melanated African American people. In the cultural sector, funding trends point to a triad of places in the part of the African continent called Sub-Saharan Africa, which attract more funding than other places. This triad of locations in Anglophone Africa consists of Nigeria in West Africa, South Africa in, of course, Southern Africa, and Kenya in East Africa. The governments in these countries have adopted national policies to promote their cultural industries, not only in word, but in practice also. Other countries such as Botswana, Rwanda, and Uganda are following suit, although I am interested to see how these policies will unfold in Zimbabwe, where state repression of thought, word, and action, as in Zimbabwe, is political strategy. Meanwhile, my 4.5 decades in the art sector have revealed yet another hegemony to me besides the hegemonies of gender, melanation, continental origin, and nation. This is the hegemony of age, where the so-called youth dividend is increasingly determines the global North's engagement with Africa beyond the same global North's engagement with governments that immiserate their subjects. As a result of the global North's youth dividend policy, only African people above the age of 18 and below the age of 35, along with their governments, are considered to be African individuals whose thoughts, speech, and actions are worthy of consideration in global northern spheres. This situation disturbingly evokes Africa's first currently known encounters with the global north, when the global north was much smaller than it is today, half a millennium ago. At that time, too, the global North's engagement with Africa was with flourishing polities through the person of the ruler, and an interest was taken in young people who were regarded as human resources for the colonial enterprise, so that their action would serve not the young people themselves and their societies, but the colonizers. My understanding of agency is that it is the power to think, speak, and act as one wishes to think, speak, and act. Human beings and other sentient organisms generally wish to live well, however they may define a state of living well. What I wish to stress, however, is that living well requires action in the material world. Action in the material world often requires the collaboration of other human beings recruited to the action in question through speech. Thought generally precedes speech, except in those moments of impulsive comment that most of us have made, regretted, and come to know better than to indulge in. Wish fulfillment, then, in the material world depends on action. Even a newborn must open its mouth to receive nourishment. Action is dependent on some form of speech, which in the main is preceded by thought. Both speech and thought require words to signify meaning. Narrative, then, which combines signifying words to produce meanings about the world and provokes thought and further speech, is a powerful mediator of agency. It is therefore not surprising that all hegemonic formations suppress the freedom of narrative formation in one way or another. The hegemonies that I have and continue to push back against in my narrative work include the following. I don't need to add anything else to the hegemonies listed in the slide, other than to mention firstly that the effects of these hegemonies is always excluding and discriminatory. And secondly, that these hegemonies intersect to produce multiple variants such as misogynoir and misotransgyny. One could say they act a bit like viruses. At the personal level, my main challenge has been lack of affiliation to an institution, so that intellectual resources are very hard to come by, especially in a country like Zimbabwe, where book imports are taxed by the kilogram, and where the study of literature at tertiary level has been abolished in state universities, so that former literature lecturers now are required to teach media. Shireen Essoff contends that a movement need not necessarily derive significance from numerical strength and also having some legal, cultural, or social or political outcome, but agrees with other global Southern feminist writers that Southern women's collective organizing may lack one or the other of these characteristics, but still qualify as a movement on the basis of ongoing actions and mobilizations. I place my work in women's representation in Zimbabwe and on the African continent firmly within such an expanded definition of a Zimbabwean and African feminist movement. To conclude, I invite you to give a big round of applause to the people in the photograph who are my colleagues at Ikapa Trust. They are from left to right: Wilbert Mamvurura, the driver and general assistant; Rumbi Musiwa, the media and communications officer; Chiedza Mashongwa, our administration intern; Angeline Mahiara, the projects officer; Florence Makore, Ikapa Trust's indomitable administrator, I don't know how she does it; and Eresina Hwede, the festival director. Olaf Koschke, the technical director, was the photographer. These are the people who work incredibly hard in a very challenging environment to make sure that all the wonderful work Ikapa does comes to fruition. The pattern behind them is from steel sculptures of curvy women that we had made in 2016 when we received a very welcome and sizable grant from the European Union. We use the sculptures for decor each year. Thank you for your attention this evening.
so much. I'm sure that there's a number of us that cannot wait to pick up your last book. And that being said, the book sales will go on till about 6:45. So if you do want to pick up a book and have her sign it, please do so after Q&A, which will have about 10 or 15 minutes, and we can discuss more during the reception. We are giving priority to students, so please do raise your hand if you have any questions.
Hi, my name's Asakulu, and I'm very curious about how creative industries or such as literature, film, fashion, how do you see trends of those industries growing or being subjugated by African governments that often act in similar ways as the colonial governments have?
Every question? You're right. Shall I go ahead and answer that? Yeah. Okay, so thank you for that question. Yes, we do have that situation on the continent where many governments are repressive and are very wary of ideas. And of course, creative industries are all about ideas. Having said that, though, I think that people are beginning, many countries are beginning to understand the economic importance of the creative industries. And so in different ways, those countries are beginning to make space. I know about Anglophone Africa, the situation in Francophone Africa is the same, but also different. So if you look at Nigeria, for example, the government did not actually set out to encourage the creative industries, but they gave them the space back in the 1970s when the oil crisis occurred and Nigeria's economy collapsed because of the collapse in the oil prices. People turned to video making because at that time the video form had been developed and it was economically within reach. And so the government allowed that space. They did not close it down. I think one of the things was that when you look at Nollywood, you see that the narrative coming out of Nollywood is of a certain kind that is not really socially engaged. So the government did not need to see it as a threat. But I still think it's a good thing that the narrative is being made. Kenya suddenly had a transformation like in the second half of the last decade. I sometimes think that a lot of things changed in Kenya during the Obama presidency here in the United States. And South Africa is an anomaly. The relationship of South Africa to film goes back to the early 20th century. Griffiths, who made the birth of a nation, actually went to South Africa to help to begin the industry in South Africa. And so they have always been plugged into the American system. And they have a huge industry in Cape Town where the studios really just produce for America and not for the home market. But nevertheless, it means it's functioning. When the ANC came into power in 1994, they realized that this is a necessary part of the economy and part of the culture. And so they did put in place programs to stimulate participation in the industry from people who had previously been excluded. This has not been very successful because the governments themselves have very little knowledge about the industry, but at least the intention is there. Botswana is beginning to see its diamonds as a finite resource and sees not so much a youth dividend, but understands that the people will always be there, and therefore investing in the people is a clever way to go. And so they are investing in the creative industries because that's an area that the youth are interested in. So there are very many different scenarios, and it really does depend on the government in place. I think that most of the governments will have to change their approach simply because of the economic pressures. So I think it will take time. However, the market is also finite. So those countries that lag behind will find that by the time they are ready to engage, that the market has already been saturated.
Hello. Sorry. Hello, I'm Abby, first year PhD French. I had a question about the location of narration, or the place of narration and subjectivity. So in your talk, you spoke about the distance, or this back and forth between being a subject but also being the writer, or I think you also used the word, this duality between being a sculptor and the model. So I'm curious, what do you think is the place of autofiction?
Is the place of
Autofiction?
autofiction? I think that it's very much in that kind of genre, because it's this idea of having to look at the self and then obtain sufficient distance to be able to narrate what you see. I think it's a valid genre. Yes, I think it's a growing genre actually, which I think is also very good. I personally do very much like to support the kind of fiction that produces new individuals that we have not read about before, so that we can see the diversity of the souls that are on this globe, and and also to see the commonalities in that diversity.
Add a follow-up to that, if possible. I was asking that because if we think about history and subjectivities that are no longer present, so for instance, there's a Caribbean author, Maryse Condé, who found Tituba on a small footnote and wrote an entire novel about her life story. So I think there's also a way in challenging these hegemonies that is not focused on the contemporary, but can also go back to the past in a way to posit a sort of future subjectivity, or a new way of looking at unsung subjectivities.
Absolutely. I do believe that subjectivities that are no longer with us are not completely lost, and we can find access to them. Of course, it cannot be as authentic as though the subject had been speaking for themselves at that time, because even memory means that you lose some authenticity about some remembered events. But I feel that it is not completely lost, and I think it's really important that we do engage in those kinds of exercises.
Thank you so much for your questions. Unfortunately, we are running tight on time, so feel free to have conversations on the side. We can go ahead and get started on the food. It's waiting outside. We have drinks. So thank you so much.
Thank you.